It is evening in the Western Pacific, and a steel sphere is sinking. Inside it, 3 people sit almost shoulder to shoulder. One of them is a microbiologist named Weishu Zhao. She works on extremophile organisms that survive conditions that should kill them, and she has spent years reading about the place she is currently falling into. She has never seen it. Outside the porthole, the water has already stopped being blue. It has been dark for some time now. And then, slowly, the dark begins to move. Small living things, lighting themselves up, drifting past the glass in numbers she was not expecting. The descent continues. 6 kilometers, 8, 10. The sphere settles onto the sea floor more than 10,000 meters below the surface, and the crew switches on the exterior lights. What appears in front of them is not a wasteland. It is a deep, strange blue, thick with drifting plankton, an environment that looks, to her eye in that moment, far more alive than anything she had been led to expect. Zhao will later say that this was the moment she understood, that the deep ocean was not a void with a few survivors scattered in it, that it was a habitat, a thriving one. She was right. And she was sitting inside one of the very few machines on Earth capable of taking a human being to that depth and bringing them back, which is the entire problem this story is about. The Mariana Trench is the deepest point on the surface of the Earth. The deepest part of the trench is a slot-shaped valley called the Challenger Deep. It sits at roughly 10,890 meters below sea level, about 35,700 feet. Popular accounts usually round it to 36,000. Here is the standard comparison, and it holds up. If you took Mount Everest and set it down at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the summit of the mountain would still be more than 2 kilometers underwater. The pressure at that depth is approximately 1,000 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. The temperature is just above freezing. The darkness is total. No sunlight has, in any meaningful sense, ever reached this part of the ocean. Now, the trench is not an isolated oddity. It belongs to a category. Scientists call it the hadal zone, everything below 6,000 meters, running down to about 11,000 at the Challenger Deep. It exists only in trenches and deep depressions, which are themselves the endpoints of plate subduction, the places where one piece of the Earth's crust slides beneath another. And here is the first number that should make you sit up. The hadal zone covers only 1 to 2% of the ocean floor, but it accounts for close to half of the ocean's total vertical depth. Almost half the up and down of the sea is contained in a sliver of seafloor most people have never heard of. That is a lot of planet to know nothing about. And we know very little. Before the year 2020, only 9 people in all of human history had visited the bottom of the Mariana Trench. 9. The American submersible Alvin, one of the workhorses of ocean science, can dive to roughly 6,500 meters, which sounds impressive, until you realize the trench floor is more than 4 kilometers below that. So the deepest 40-something% of the ocean has been, for most of the history of oceanography, functionally off-limits. Which brings us to a scientist named Tim Shank. Shank is a deep-sea biologist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, and he has a problem he has been chewing on for a very long time. For nearly 2 decades, he has been working on a single instrument, a chemical sensor designed to detect things like hydrogen sulfide, iron sulfides, oxygen, peroxide, and organic compounds directly in the water, in place, without hauling a sample to the surface. When he started, that instrument weighed 60 to 70 pounds. Today, it weighs under 10, and it can run for 8 days on its own. 20 years, 1 sensor, 60 pounds of weight removed, gram by gram. That is not the behavior of someone with a passing interest. Shank talks about the hadal zone the way other people talk about a country they have never been allowed to enter. He points out that it has organisms with adaptations found nowhere else, animals that have produced entirely novel genes, and therefore an enormous capacity for discovering natural products, antibiotics, treatments for disease. He also makes a connection that most people never make out loud. The proteins in hadal fish have to keep working under pressure that should deform them. In human diseases like Alzheimer's, proteins stop operating correctly. Shank sees those two problems as versions of each other. Learn how a fish solves it, and you may learn something about how we fail at it. So he wants to get down there, badly. And to do it, he went to NASA. Before we follow him there, we need to establish what is actually at stake, because for a long time, the assumption was that the hadal zone would be biologically thin, crushing pressure, near freezing water, almost no food. The reasonable expectation was a handful of specialists barely hanging on. That assumption held mostly because nobody had enough samples to challenge it. Earlier work on Mariana Trench sediment microbes had been limited to something like 96 samples from 34 sites, spread across 9 separate published papers. Most studies examined 1 to 3 sites. It was, in effect, a picture assembled from a few pixels. Then, between August and November of 2021, a Chinese research team changed the resolution. Using a full ocean-depth crewed submersible called Fenduje, the same vessel Weishu Zhao was riding in the cold open, they conducted 33 dives across the Mariana Trench, the neighboring Yap Trench, and the Philippine Basin. They worked at depths between roughly 5,900 and 10,900 meters. Their cumulative time on the seafloor passed 2,000 hours. Fenduje was built for exactly this. It carries 3 people, has a pair of robotic arms and a sample basket rated to 220 kilograms, and can stay on the bottom for 6 hours at a stretch. Deep-sea researchers who have looked at it tend to describe it in the language of engineering admiration rather than science. The haul was 1,648 sediment samples, more than 10 times larger than every previously reported hadal collection combined. They sequenced it. And here is what came back: 7,564 microbial species. 89.4% of them had never been documented before. Sit with that for a second, because the number is easy to skim past. This is not a study that found some new species. This is a study in which nearly 9 out of every 10 organisms recovered were unknown to science. Compared against the global ocean microbiome database, the overlap was 0.5%. Compared against previous Mariana Trench data, specifically data collected from the same trench, the overlap was around 7%. They were sampling the same place other people had sampled and finding almost entirely different life. And then there is the detail inside the detail. 3 of the recovered genomes could not be classified at all. Not to a genus, not to a family, not to a phylum. The researchers labeled them MIR01, MIR02, and MIR03, placed them on the tree of life as best they could, and noted that they appear to represent 3 previously undocumented high-level lineages. In everyday terms, 3 organisms that do not fit on any branch we have. Despite occupying less than 1% of the ocean's area, the trench's microbial diversity turned out to be roughly comparable to the global ocean as a whole. As one of the researchers put it, 80% of the world's hadal zone remains a mystery, and there could be far stranger things in it still. So how does anything live there? The answer the data suggests is that there is not one answer. There are 2. The first strategy is streamlining. Some hadal microbes carry small, tight genomes with a narrow set of functions, no spare capacity, nothing carried that is not paid for. What those genomes are optimized for is telling. A large share of their unique genes handle 2 jobs. The first is eating things that are extremely hard to eat. Aromatic compounds, the stubborn, ring-shaped carbon molecules that most organisms leave alone, appear to be a genuine food source down there. In an environment where almost nothing edible falls from above, being able to metabolize the leftovers is not a quirk. It is the whole business model. The second job is damage control. Both high pressure and near freezing cold generate reactive oxygen species inside a cell molecules that tear up membranes and DNA. So these organisms carry heavy antioxidation machinery, plus genes for repairing DNA after the damage happens anyway. They are, in effect, permanently running a maintenance crew. The second strategy is the opposite: larger genomes, wider metabolic range, more sensors. These microbes carry systems for detecting temperature shifts, antibiotics, viruses, and chemical signals from their neighbors, along with transporters for a broad menu of sugars and amino acids. They are not optimized, they are prepared. And there is a pattern to where each strategy wins. Toward the trench bottom, the dispersal-limited, versatile types become more prominent. Deeper in the sediment, microbial networks become measurably more connected, more nodes, more links, more interaction. In the shallowest sediment layers, the average connection count was around 2 to 3. 20 to 30 centimeters down, it rose to as high as 23, which means cooperation increases with depth. Researchers found stable pairs of organisms with complementary metabolisms, one species degrading aromatic compounds, its partner taking the resulting products into its own energy cycle and returning a molecule that appears to improve both partners' tolerance to pressure. Down there, at the edge of what life can do, organisms stop competing quite so hard and start trading. The larger animals show the same fingerprints. The hadal snailfish and the hadal amphipod, a vertebrate and an invertebrate, separated by an enormous evolutionary distance, turned out to share adaptations with the microbes around them. Enhanced antioxidation. Accumulation of compatible solutes inside cells to keep proteins functional under pressure. 3 separate domains of life, arriving at the same answers. There is also the genetic evidence from the fish themselves. The deepest living fish that has been caught and tested carried 12 genes coding for the integrity of its cell membranes. A normal fish carries 4 or 5. It also produced biomolecules that hold water inside individual cells, so that its proteins can keep working under the crushing weight above them. That is Tim Shank's Alzheimer's parallel, in physical form. A fish that has solved, by evolution, a version of a problem we are still losing to in hospitals. And one more finding, which we will come back to. The researchers noted that some of these deep microbes appear to have a real talent for breaking down pollutants, taking human-made compounds apart and harvesting energy from them. At the time, it read as a promising side note about biotechnology. Now back to NASA. There is an old line that gets repeated so often, it has lost its teeth. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the depths of our own ocean. At the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, somebody decided to do something about both at once. Starting in 2018, the two institutions co-developed a new class of underwater vehicle. Woods Hole built the platform. JPL contributed something less obvious and more interesting: navigation. Here is the problem they were solving. At full ocean depth, traditional acoustic navigation barely works. You are 11 kilometers from the surface, in total darkness, with no reference points and no satellite signal of any kind. A vehicle down there does not reliably know where it is. JPL had already solved a version of this on another planet. The technology is called terrain relative navigation, and it was developed for the Mars rover and for Ingenuity, the robotic helicopter that flew in the Martian atmosphere. The software looks at what the camera sees, identifies unique features in the terrain, even something as subtle as ripples in sand, and uses them as landmarks, connecting them into a running map as the vehicle moves. Shank describes what it produces on the seafloor as a feature map built from nothing but the ground itself. The plan is to combine that with visual camera data to build 3-dimensional maps of the seafloor at centimeter, or even millimeter, scale. And the cost of the hardware is almost comic. A machine vision camera of the kind required runs in the region of $1,700. Compared with developing new acoustic systems rated for that depth, At that risk, it is nothing. The vehicles themselves were named Orpheus and Eurydice after the lovers of Greek myth, one of whom went down into the underworld to retrieve the other. Somebody at Woods Hole was in a literary mood, and honestly, they earned it. Orpheus is small, about 5.5 feet long, roughly 172 centimeters by 101 by 130. The third prototype was built around an aluminium frame drilled with carefully placed holes to keep its base weight near 250 kilograms, because every extra ounce has to be counteracted with additional buoyancy, which costs you again. Casey Machado, one of the original designers and the operations manager at the institution's autonomous vehicle facility, describes the design philosophy in terms borrowed directly from spaceflight. She calls it the rocket equation approach. Question everything that goes on the vehicle. Make single sensors do multiple jobs. Assume nothing is free. The body is made largely of syntactic foam, an engineered material with tiny hollow glass spheres suspended in a matrix. The spheres make it lighter than water. The matrix keeps them from being crushed. The foam-to-vehicle ratio is calibrated, so the whole system sits as close to neutrally buoyant as possible, which minimizes the energy it burns, just staying in place. There is a small piece of history in that foam, by the way. The same kind of material went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the vehicle that carried the filmmaker James Cameron there in 2012. He donated his leftover stock for use in the earlier Orpheus prototypes. The brains sit in a sphere at the nose, 17 inches across, made of extremely thick glass, holding the batteries, the electronics, and a high-definition camera at ordinary atmospheric pressure. That sphere has to withstand 11,000 meters of water pressing in on it. Justin Osolinsky, who directs the facility where it was built, puts it plainly. It has to be strong, and then stronger than that. Unlike most autonomous underwater vehicles, which are built to glide long distances and avoid the bottom entirely, Orpheus is built to land on it. It has skids. It settles onto the sea floor, drops into a low-power stationary mode, and can then do work that would normally require a completely different class of machine. It can push into the mud and pull out sediment cores. It can lift off, thrust forward a few feet, and set down again, hopping across the bottom. And why does any of this matter to a space agency? Because there are 6 ocean worlds in our solar system. Ice-covered oceans on moons, kilometers upon kilometers of ice, and beneath it, what researchers believe are salty seas. Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, is the one that gets the most attention. The reasoning goes like this. Europa has a saltwater ocean and a hard core at its center, similar in broad structure to Earth. Jupiter's gravity squeezes that core, pushes and pulls it, and the friction generates heat. That heat fractures the rock. Seawater works its way down into the fractures, gets superheated, and rushes back up through the sea floor, which is, mechanically, what hydrothermal vents do on Earth. If life can start and persist around vents at the bottom of our ocean, the argument runs, then the same conditions may exist under the ice of another world. The central question is whether anything is living there. Woods Hole and JPL have been working through the practical problem that follows: how a vehicle at the bottom of an alien ocean would communicate to another vehicle, up to a surface lander, and back to Earth. NASA's Europa Clipper mission was designed to study the Moon during a series of flybys while in orbit around Jupiter, but an orbiter looks at ice from above. Getting under it is a different proposition entirely, and there is exactly one place on Earth where you can practice. Now here's the strange part. For all the ambition, the trench keeps winning. Start with the fear that sits underneath the entire enterprise. Victoria Orphan is a geobiologist at Caltech who has worked with an Orpheus vehicle on a science campaign. She describes the fundamental anxiety of the field with unusual honesty. Anytime you do anything in the deep ocean, when you put something over the side of a ship, you run the risk that it does not come back. That is not a small risk emotionally, and it is not a small risk financially. Conventional deep-sea vehicles can cost between $5 and $10 million. Scientists compete for limited time on a small number of them. Losing one is a catastrophe measured in years of lost research, not just money. Orphan's own experience shows how it goes even when nothing is lost. In the spring of 2024, her team took an Orpheus vehicle to study deep-sea methane seeps off Alaska's Aleutian Islands. The plan was to map the area first, then send down the crewed submersible Alvin for detailed work. Frigid temperatures, steep topography, problems nobody had anticipated. It took the full 3 weeks of the expedition to get high-resolution photographs of the seeps. 3 weeks for photographs. And that was a shallow warm-up compared to the target. Her verdict afterward was not disappointment, though. It was that the interface between the sediment and the water is full of genuinely unknown science, and that this class of instrument, with the right sensors, could be the thing that finally opens it. That is the pattern across this entire field, and I want to be careful not to repeat it 7 times because the shape is always the same. Deploy. Encounter something the engineering did not predict. Learn. Try again. The second attempt worth mentioning is the one that actually reached depth. In May of 2025, an expedition aboard the exploration vessel Nautilus took an Orpheus vehicle to the waters around the Mariana Islands for 3 weeks. 6 autonomous dives. 68 hours of dive time, but only about 16.5 hours actually exploring the seafloor. 2 of those dives were pure engineering tests at around 2,400 meters, checking whether components worked at all in the field. 4 dives made it to between 5,600 and 5,700 meters. On 2 of them, the vehicle photographed fields of polymetallic nodules, metal-rich lumps, sitting on the seabed at 5,645 meters east of the northern Mariana Islands. Those were the first direct observations of those sites, ever. And the sites had been chosen in advance by geologists who predicted nodules would probably be there. They were right, and until that vehicle arrived, nobody had confirmed it. 16 hours of seafloor time, at half the depth of the trench, produced a genuine first. That is the ratio we are working with. The vehicle is rated to 11,000 meters. As of these expeditions, its operational record sat at a little over 5,700. And the deeper problem is one that cannot be engineered around at all. Hadal conditions cannot be replicated in a laboratory. You cannot build the trench in a tank and run experiments in it, which means every ecological theory about how that ecosystem works, every metabolic prediction, remains unvalidated by experiment. The researchers who published the largest hadal dataset ever assembled said so directly in their own limitations section. You have to go there. There is no other way to know. There is one more piece of the trench that explains why space agencies keep looking at it, and it is not the deep part. Less than 100 kilometers west of the Mariana Trench, on the overriding tectonic plate, sits a chain of structures found nowhere else on Earth. They are called serpentinite mud volcanoes. At least 19 of them are active. Here is how they form. The Pacific Plate is sliding beneath the Philippine Sea Plate. As it goes down, it dewaters, releasing fluid upward into the mantle rock above. That fluid reacts with the rock in a process called serpentinization, and the reaction produces hydrogen and methane. Faults reaching 10 to 25 kilometers down let the resulting mud and fluid rise buoyantly to the sea floor, where it piles up into mountains of mud. The fluid coming out of them is cold under 3.5 degrees Celsius. It is also extraordinarily alkaline, reaching a pH as high as 12.6. For context, that is far outside the range most life on Earth tolerates. And it is rich in hydrogen, methane, acetate, formate, and methanol, and the chemical signatures indicate that most of these are being produced without any biology involved at all. Rock and water alone, making the building blocks. This is why researchers describe the Mariana Forearc as an Earth analog for extraterrestrial exploration. It is a place where chemistry, unaided, generates the fuel that life elsewhere runs on. Modern serpentine mud volcanoes have been found nowhere else on the planet, and the geological record suggests this kind of volcanism was happening as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. In other words, it is a working model of the early Earth, and possibly of a seafloor under another world's ice. So the obvious question is whether anything lives in it. The cell counts are low and variable. The conditions are brutal even by deep-sea standards: high pH, almost no nutrients, seepage that comes and goes. And yet, the biomarker evidence from cores taken at 2 of these mud volcanoes shows a clear signal. Microbial communities are there, persisting across steep chemical gradients, and they have shifted their strategy over time. The isotope signatures point to a transition. Earlier, organisms making methane. Later, organisms consuming it, anaerobic methane oxidation coupled to sulfate reduction. The membranes tell the story too. Bacterial lipids shift from one structural type to another, with depth, growing longer and more unsaturated, which is what membranes do when they are adapting to environmental stress. The phrase the researchers used is that life there operates at the fringes of habitability, not thriving, not dying, holding. There is one more anomaly worth putting on the table, because it overturns something the field believed for a long time. There is a compound called trimethylamine N-oxide. It stabilizes proteins under high pressure, and the established expectation was that its concentration rises steadily in fish as depth increases, a straightforward chemical solution scaling with the problem. When researchers looked at fish living below 6,000 meters, they found no significant rise. Something else is happening down there. We do not know what. To understand how thin our knowledge actually is, it helps to compare the machines. Alvin, the crude workhorse of American ocean science, reaches about 6,500 meters, which is to say, it can just barely enter the shallowest edge of the hadal zone, and nothing more. Fendouje goes to full ocean depth and carries 3 people. But there is a very small number of vessels like it in the world. Orpheus was designed to break that bottleneck by being cheap. At under 600 pounds and less than 2 meters long, its builders describe it as the smallest and least expensive vehicle on the market, capable of descending to 6,000 meters. Where existing options run $5 to $10 million, the target price is a couple of $100,000, roughly a tenth of what comparable work costs today. The reason that matters is not economy, it is scale. Shank's stated goal is 10 to 12 of these vehicles operating simultaneously below 6,000 meters in a single trench, communicating with each other, reporting to the surface. Not one machine taking one snapshot. A fleet holding a presence. And then a global tour, because there is strong reason to believe the trenches differ from one another. Individual trenches appear to have their own signature of life, their own species. Closely related to neighboring trenches, often, but seemingly evolving in isolation, in place. The mere data supports this. Microbial communities in the Mariana Trench, the Yap Trench, and the Philippine Basin were statistically distinct from each other, and communities at the trench bottom differed from those on the slopes. They are separate worlds, sitting in the same ocean. Because the smaller vehicles do not need a large research ship to deploy them, one deep-sea ecologist has argued they could help democratize deep-sea science, making it accessible to countries without a research fleet. But nobody involved is under any illusion about how much has been covered so far. Victoria Orphan's description of what each dive returns is the most honest line in this entire story, the smallest of postage stamps of our planet. That is the state of the art. Postage stamps. Which brings us back to Weishu Zhao, sitting in that sphere, because there is a second thing she saw down there, and it was not bioluminescence. During the dives, the team came across plastic bags, beer bottles, soda cans, and at the bottom of the Yap Trench, a nearly intact laundry basket. She described it as deeply shocking. She was not the first to see it, and the fuller picture is worse than a few objects. Between 2008 and 2017, a British-led team collected amphipods, small, pale, shrimp-like scavengers from 9 sites across 6 of the deepest trenches around the Pacific Rim. They dissected the hindguts, specifically to rule out anything the animals might have eaten on the way up. Of 90 animals examined, 65 contained man-made fibers or fragments, 72%. In the Mariana Trench, at 10,890 meters, the figure was 100%. Every single amphipod collected from the deepest place on the planet had eaten our material. They also carried the highest average count of any site sampled. The particles were not exotic. Nylon, polyethylene, polyamide, polyvinyls, rayon, lyocell, rami, the semi-synthetic fibers that clothing is made from. Ordinary things from ordinary lives, thousands of kilometers away. None of the 15 fibers analyzed in detail turned out to be naturally occurring. And in 2018, a plastic shopping bag was documented at 10,898 meters in the Mariana Trench. The mechanism is not mysterious. Plastic enters the sea from rivers, coastlines, and open dumping. Sunlight and abrasion break it into fragments. The fragments sink, slowly, sometimes over decades, and arrive in the trench along with the marine snow that the animals down there are evolved to eat. As the researcher who led that work observed, contaminate a river and it flushes clean, contaminate a coastline and the tide dilutes it. But at the deepest point of the ocean, it simply sits there. Nothing goes in or out. The amphipods have no way of telling the difference. They are calibrated by millions of years of evolution to consume whatever organic material falls from above, because so little of it ever does. And now remember the finding from earlier, the one that passed by as a footnote. The hadal microbes that turned out to be unusually good at breaking down pollutants and pulling energy out of them. That capability was framed as a possible gift to us, a source of new solutions. It is also, read another way, a description of an ecosystem that has already begun metabolizing our civilization. So here is where we actually stand. We built machines using navigation software written for another planet to explore an ocean we hoped might teach us how to search for life beneath the ice of a distant moon. We chose the Mariana Trench because it is the most alien environment we can physically reach, the closest thing to Europa that exists on Earth. And when we finally got there, in numbers, with the right instruments, we found nearly 9,000 species we had never seen. 3 organisms that fit nowhere on the tree of life. Chemistry that manufactures the ingredients of biology without any help from biology at all, and a laundry basket. The technology to explore another world's ocean is being tested in the last place on our own that we had not yet touched. And we arrived to discover that our garbage had beaten us there by decades. We reached it without ever going. 80% of the hadal zone is still unmapped, still unnamed, still unvisited, and it is already not pristine. We went looking for the edge of the world and found our own fingerprints on it.